Is it a rebuild for Pitt at defensive end this season, or is it a reload? We're going to be breaking down the position on this week's position preview episode of the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right, it's Wednesday. It's the Morning Pitt. It's youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak. The website is Panther-Lair.com. You know the deal. It's the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. All the latest Pitt sports coverage. You find it at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to talk with other Pitt fans about Pitt sports all day, every day. Pitt fans are on there talking about Pitt sports and a lot of other topics, some of them inbounds and some of them out of bounds. But for the most part, it's Pitt fans talking to other Pitt fans about Pitt sports. And that's what makes it a lot of fun all day, every day on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. And then, of course, most days of the week, we got stuff going on right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We have our daily Morning Pitt videos, Monday through Friday. It's a little Pitt talk to get your day started. We have the weekly live show, which we do every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. We'll do that tonight. Me and Jim Hammond will get together to talk to you about Pitt sports. And then we have player interviews and recruit interviews and practice highlights and all kinds of video content right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And you want to make sure you don't miss any of it, so like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We make it very easy for you. The subscribe button is right down there. YouTube has its own subscribe button down there somewhere. They have a like button as well. Click those things and it'll make me happy. Thank you. We've been going position by position over the past, 5 weeks. This will be week 6 of our position preview series. Every Wednesday, we've been breaking down a different position. I'm able to recall the number off the top of my head because I know we did 5 offensive positions over the last 5 weeks. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and offensive line. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. I had to make sure that was actually 5. And now we're flipping over to defense, and we're starting at defensive end. And I said it right from the top. It's a question that I've been wondering. It's a question you've probably been wondering. And maybe it's semantics, but I don't think it is. Is Pitt undergoing a rebuild or a reload at defensive end? Because there's probably, there's turnover. First of all, it's college sports. There's turnover every year. Every year you're going to have positions where players run out of eligibility, and you're going to have to replace them with guys who maybe don't have as much experience or don't have as much proven production. And that's just inevitable. It's part of the cycle. And it's going to be, every year. You're going to have some spots that you're going to have to, fill in. And it's either going to be a rebuild or a reload. And this year, defensive end is one of those spots in a pretty big way. As big as any other way, I would say. I'm not, you can make a case that safety is undergoing a similar transition. And that's probably, those are probably the two biggest, obviously quarterback, but at least on the defense, those are the two biggest positions that you're rebuilding or you're reloading, defensive end and safety. And I think defensive end, just because they've had some really big names and some prominent players there over the last few years that they're going to be replacing this year. You look at the scholarship board from last year. I think they had 10 scholarship defensive ends on the roster to start the season, and 5 of those guys are gone. A couple left via transfer, a couple went out of eligibility, a couple just decided to get on with their life's work, whatever it may be. You're now replacing some guys who have been mainstays of the rotation. You're talking about Haba Baldonado. You're talking about Deslin Alexander. You're talking about John Morgan. And while we could go down a side discussion of how productive some of those guys actually were when they were healthy, the fact remains that they played the bulk of the snaps. They made the bulk of the starts. And those were the primary players at defensive end for Pitt really over the last couple of seasons, basically since 2021 and 2022, since Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver moved on. And I think it's important to bring up Jones and Weaver because those guys were consensus All-Americans in 2020. Jones, Jones in 2000, you could date this back to like 2018, honestly, when Rashad Weaver had 14 tackles for loss and 6.5 sacks. 2019, Patrick Jones had 12 tackles for loss and 8.5 sacks. Weaver didn't play because he got hurt. But then when the two of them were together as bookend defensive ends, In 2020, they combined for 27.5 tackles for loss and 16.5 sacks. Jones had 13 and 9. Weaver had 14.5 and 7.5. They both earned All-America honors for that. They were all ACC players, and they were dominant forces and led to the best production numbers we've seen out of the defensive ends, basically under Pat Narduzzi. The position group as a whole that year, 2020, playing in only 11 games. The position group as a whole had 36.5 tackles for loss and 22 sacks. They have not produced those numbers each of the last 2 seasons. However, when Jones and Weaver left, there were questions. Who's going to step up? Who's going to be ready? I mean, Haba Baldonado, I don't know if he played at all in 2020. In 19, he had 5.5 tackles for loss and 4 sacks. Baldonado did. He played like a very little bit, maybe 1 game, and got hurt. But he had 5.5 tackles for loss and 4 sacks, so there was a little bit of an expectation there. In 2019, Deslin Alexandra also had 10.5 tackles for loss and 5.5 sacks, and now these were going to be the guys who were counted on to produce at a high level, and in 2021 they did. Baldonado had 11.5 tackles for loss and 9 sacks. Alexander had 3.5 and 2.5. John Morgan chipped in 6.5 and 5.5. And you get a couple of other guys. Dayon Hayes had 7.5 tackles for loss and 2 sacks. They end up with more than 30 tackles for loss and more than 20 sacks. A fall from the previous year when they played 11 games. In 2021, they played 14, and the production went down. But it was still pretty good production out of the position. The numbers dropped again last year, largely, I would say, due to Haba Baldonado missing time and being hurt. He finished with only 5 tackles for loss and 2 sacks. Deslin Alexander had more than that. He had 6.5 and 5.5. John Morgan had 5.5 and 2.5. Dayon Hayes had 4.5 tackles for loss and 3.5 sacks. So a few other guys picked up the slack, but the end result was the least productive season from the defensive ends over the last 5 years. I only compiled the stats going back to 2018, but last year, with 23 tackles for loss and 14.5 sacks out of the position, it was the least productive year we've seen from the defensive ends over the 5 years I looked at. The production dropping from that high in 2020 when Jones and Weaver were All-Americans and dropping down to what they did last year. And so that sets up an interesting scenario or an interesting situation for this season, because you're coming off a year where the production had dropped. The production was low. I mean, you didn't get what you were expecting out of Haba Baldonado. John Morgan and Deslin Alexandra never really in their careers were the kinds of guys to pick up the slack in production. John Morgan, for all his talk, I mean, just to put it kind of bluntly, and all the expectations that were sort of placed on him every year, never really produced at that high of a level. 2021, he had 6.5 tackles for loss and 5.5 sacks. Those are good numbers. Good if that's your number 3 guy, maybe your number 2, but not lead the team type of stats. And last year, 5.5 and 2.5. I mean, somebody needed to step up and get pressure on the quarterback last season, and it wasn't John Morgan. John Morgan had 2.5 sacks last year. Alexandra had more. Dayon Hayes had more. It wasn't enough production. So it's interesting because we're going to talk so much about the changeover at defensive end, and I've been writing about it all week about it's a rebuild or it's a reload. But the reality is they're coming off a year where maybe the play dipped a little bit at that position. So not only are we talking about is it a rebuild or is it a reload, we're also talking about can they build the position back up. Not necessarily rebuild, but just build it back up to some of the levels it reached over the previous few years before 2022. And I don't have the answer to that question yet. On the rebuild-reload question, I'm inclined to lean toward reload for a few reasons, the most prominent of which, and the reason that should give everyone confidence about the defensive line as a whole and the ends in particular, is Charlie Partridge. And Charlie Partridge, I think, has done it well enough and done it long enough that he gets some benefit of the doubt. So even though they're going into a season where the defensive ends are going to be, Dayon Hayes, who's got some career production, and then a lot of guys who don't. Bam Brima and Nate Temple and Nikai Johnson and Sam Okunlola and Jimmy Scott and Antonio Cayman and Maverick Gracio. There's not a whole lot of career production there outside of Dayon Hayes, and even he just has some. I thought I had his full stats. Yeah. So in 27 games since the 2020 season, Dayon Hayes has recorded 36 tackles, 15 tackles for loss, and 8.5 sacks. That's over 3 seasons, 20, 21, and 22. 27 games, 8.5 sacks. The average is, 1 sack every 3 games or something like that, or a little bit more. 1 sack every 3-point-something games. So, but he's the elder statesman of the group. He's the most productive player in the group, and he's the one that people are counting on the most to sort of step up and take the lead. And that is the first thing that has to happen here. To me, the number one thing with the defensive ends, the number one key to making this a reload and making this an actual build on what was last year, a rebound more than a rebuild, a rebound and a reload, the key is Dayon Hayes. He's a senior now. The 4-star out of Westinghouse somehow was in the recruiting class of 2020. It seems like that time has gone by very quickly. I can't believe he's already a senior. And to be quite honest, I can't believe he's sort of only produced what he has over the last 3 seasons. A big part of that is being blocked a little bit. He was behind Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver. He was behind Haba Baldonado and Deslin Alexander and John Morgan. And whether he should have been or shouldn't have, he was. And so that's part of the reason his production has not been where it needs to be. But now he's in a put up or shut up year. And because he was on the roster in 2020, he'll have the option to use the COVID year. So in theory, he could come back in 2024. But it's pretty much now or never for Dayon Hayes. I don't think I don't know. I haven't asked him about it, but I'm guessing he doesn't want to come back in 2024. I'm guessing he wants to play like an NFL draft prospect this year and go into the draft next spring and make his pro career. I'm guessing that's the intention, but I don't think he's really done it to this point. He hasn't made himself into an NFL draft prospect. He doesn't have the production. He doesn't have the film. And so this year is huge for Dayon Hayes, and it's huge for Pitt's defense and defensive ends and defensive line that Hayes has that kind of year. And I'm talking, look at some of these numbers we've seen from some of these guys. Baldonado in 2021, 11.5 tackles for loss and 9 sacks. A year like that. Patrick Jones in 2020, 13 tackles for loss and 9 sacks. A year like that. Rashad Weaver that year, 14.5 and 7.5, a year like that. Patrick Jones a year earlier, 12 and 8.5, a year like that. Double-digit tackles for loss, north of 8 sacks. I mean, he's got to be in that territory. I think that's the kind of year they need from Dayon Hayes, and I believe he's capable of it. As I kind of spend all this time sort of casting doubt on it and talking about how he hasn't done it yet, I think he's capable of it. I think he is that talented a player. I don't think we misevaluated him. I don't think Pitt was wrong in its evaluation and prioritizing him in that 2020 class. And I think he has all the talent to live up to the expectations. He's got to get on the field and do it. He's got to stay healthy. He has to stay out of trouble. And he has to go out and make the plays. Dayon Hayes is one of the keys to this defense because of how important the pass rush is to, how the whole thing works together, right? We talk all the time about how Pat Narduzzi puts his corners out on an island and he really stresses those guys and they're in a difficult position. Well, they benefit a lot from the pressure that's created up front. Some could say that the pressure benefits from the coverage from the corners, and I think there's some truth to that as well. But the years where the passing defense really excelled, guys like Jones and Weaver and Baldonado were making plays. They were getting into the backfield, they were sacking the quarterback, and they were making life difficult, forcing him, either getting him down for a play for loss or forcing him into a bad decision or a bad throw or a rush decision, which gives Pitt's defensive backs a better chance at making plays in their area of the field. So Dayon Hayes is huge. And everybody knows that. And any conversation you have with a Pitt fan about the defensive ends this year, it's always going to start with Dayon Hayes. That's the first name anyone's going to bring up because he's going to be the number one guy, and he's expected to be. But what happens after that? That's the big question, and that's where it starts to feel, that's where you start to really get into the question of rebuild or reload. If you look at the guys on the depth chart, or on the scholarship board, I should say, because I don't even know what the depth chart is going to look like. Hayes is a senior. Bam Brima is a senior. Nate Temple is a senior. Okay, maybe that's one of the starters. You got a redshirt sophomore, Nakai Johnson. I don't see any reason to rule out Nakai Johnson being a starting defensive end. I don't think the redshirt freshmen, Sam Okunlola or Jimmy Scott, will be starting defensive ends. but I think they're going to play. I think Okunlola at the very least. I mean, I hear as much hype and expectations and excitement about him as I hear about anybody. I think he's going to play and be really good, probably in a reserve role, but maybe that reserve who can go out and have, 8 tackles for loss and 4.5 sacks or something along those lines. I mean, those would be great numbers to get out of a reserve defensive end. I don't know who starts next to Dayon Hayes, but I think Hayes, Johnson, and quite possibly Okunlola end up as 3 of the 4 guys in the primary 2-deep rotation, which means one of your seniors is probably not going to be in it. And we haven't seen much from Bambrima, but we've seen less from Nate Temple. I think Bambrima's got a real chance to be a starting defensive end this year. I saw him at Pitt's prospect camp this summer. He wasn't working out. He was coaching. He was helping the Pitt players help out when they have those prospect camps. They assist the coaches, and they actually run some of the drills themselves. And just seeing him standing there, I mean, he's built like an NFL guy right now. There's a handful of guys on this roster. You could probably guess a few of them that I'm going to name. There are a handful of guys on this roster that are built like NFL players right now. Bengali Kamara is one of them. Solomon DeShields is not far off. I think MJ Devonshire might be in that borderline NFL body. Bambrima is that. I mean, he's got that build and that physique and all those, the frame and the wingspan and the length and the height, all those things. He's just got to get consistent playing time, and he's got to show what he can do. He's got to put his talent on the field, because I think the talent is there, but he's got to do it consistently. And the funny thing with all of these guys we're talking about, whether it's Hayes or it's Brima or it's Nakai Johnson, it's Nate Temple, any of these guys, all right? Haba Baldonado could have come back for another year. John Morgan has another year of eligibility. He decided to transfer to Arkansas. If one or both of those guys came back, I think you run a real risk, and we've talked about this before, run a real risk of losing a guy like Nakai Johnson or Sam Okunlola or Jimmy Scott to the transfer portal. Okunlola and Scott haven't been waiting quite as long as Johnson has. Johnson's been waiting a year longer than those guys have. Brima's been waiting, even longer, and Hayes has been waiting even longer. If you start bringing back some of those seniors this year, I think you lose some of the younger defensive ends who just don't want to wait anymore. And we talked about it when John Morgan went into the transfer portal. That I don't know if Pitt pushed him out. I don't necessarily think they forced him out. But I think when he said he was thinking about it or that he wanted to go, I think the coaches were accepting of that decision, because they knew, I think they probably went into last season thinking, all right, 22 is going to be our last year with this group, these guys, Baldonado and Alexander and Morgan, and at 23 we're going to move over to a new group. We're going to turn over a new collection of defensive ends out here, and it's going to be a changeover year. It's going to be a transition year at that position. I guess this is a way of saying those guys had to go. Like they needed to move on and make way for the new generation of defensive ends. And that's what you're going to see out there. You're going to see Dayon Hayes, who you've only seen sometimes. You're going to see Bambrima, who you haven't seen much of. You're going to see Nakai Johnson, who hasn't played much. You're going to see Okunlola and Scott. Okunlola played the final 4 games of the season last year, actually, once he finally got healthy, which makes me think he might have been an option to play earlier if he didn't get hurt. I think either in training camp or right before training camp. But he ended up playing in the final 4 games, the last 3 games in November, and then the bowl game, the Sun Bowl. Jimmy Scott didn't see any playing time, but the coaches are high on him as well. I don't know how this group is going to work out. I don't know how this group is going to do, but it's exciting to, kind of be on the verge of seeing new guys, you know what I mean? And seeing some new guys who were highly touted. I mean, I think we were all excited about Dayon Hayes when he signed with Pitt, and Sam Okunlola and Nakai Johnson. I mean, these guys were 4-star prospects, and I don't think those were bad ratings or bad evaluations. I think they really are good players who deserve the rankings that they had, and now they're finally going to get a chance to show what they can do. Is it a rebuild? Is it a reload? Is it a rebound? We don't know. We'll find out at the end of the season when we find out if these guys are ready. If Charlie Partridge believes in them, that's good enough for me at least to get through the month of August, and then we'll have the games actually start, and we'll see if they're truly up to snuff. But it's going to be interesting to watch. I think the linebackers and corners will be fun to watch, because I think those guys are talented and experienced, and there's some high expectations for that group. I think the DNs and the safeties are going to be fun to watch because it's going to be a whole new crop of players out there. And that's going to be exciting because there's some really talented guys in those groups. And I'm looking forward to it, and I think you probably are too. I think Charlie Partridge is too. You always like to have veterans and guys you can count on, guys who have been around for years and years. But I think he's excited to see some of these young guys too and see how they do on the field. Well, we'll see if it pays off for the defense. But we'll be keeping an eye on it. Next week, we've got defensive tackles to talk about. There are more returning players there, but there's going to be a big hole to fill, as you might know, with Kalijah Cansey. So, going to talk about how they'll try to do that. That might rely on some young players as well. Don't forget, we got the live show tonight, 8:30 p.m. right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Jim Hammond and I will be here talking about all things Pitt sports, so tune in this evening, set a reminder, or you could just subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications, and you get an alert sent to your phone every time we go live or post new video content right here at youtube.com. So tune in for that tonight. And then, of course, check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet for all your Pitt football, basketball, and recruiting coverage. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Thanks for checking out the video today. I appreciate it. Hope you've had a great start to your week and hope you have a great Wednesday. We'll talk to you tonight on the live show, and then we'll be back with you tomorrow for another Morning Pit right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.